So today is a joint event between Social Research Association and the Royal Statistical Society. Thanks in particular to Graham Farron and to Paul Gentry, who always seem to make these things happen. Many of you will be members of the Royal Statistical Society, so I just wanted to say first that if you get emails from the Royal Statistical Society and they mention that there's a book competition, enter, because it's a real competition, because today I found out that I won Charles Booth's poverty map of London, which is like worth loads of money. So I'm really, really excited by that. Yeah. But a key thing is that this was a very early reminder that we cannot understand inequalities between groups in society without quantitative data. So quantitative data and its careful curation and detailed collection are crucial to understanding inequalities. Now, today's event is part of an annual series commemorating Cathie Marsh. Now, some of you will have known Cathie Marsh, some of you will have worked with her. She died nearly 30 years ago, and she was aged 40. She was an outstanding social researcher and an analyst, and she was working at a time when sociology did not favour the survey. They thought the survey was boring. Can you believe that? And it was a very much anti-positivist tradition at that point. But what she articulated was that surveys could ask about subjective experiences. And not only that, but that surveys were crucial to understanding differences in subjective experiences between groups. So very relevant to today's talk. I work mostly with the National Centre for Social Research. I work mostly with mental health data, but in my work, mental health is a complete misnomer. I work mainly with depression, despair, anxiety, misery, and in fact, many of us in this room will spend a lot of time counting negatives: crime, cancer, unemployment. So it is with great relief to be able to introduce today a focus on happiness and on the positive. Paul Dolan will speak first, and he needs little introduction because he is very well known. He is the head of department and professor of psychological and behaviour science at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and he researches and writes about the measurement of happiness and its causes and its consequences. So he's not only an eminent academic who's worked at many universities, York, Sheffield, Imperial, Princeton, but he also reaches a much wider audience as well, because he has published two very successful popular books, Happiness by Design and Happy Ever After. But I think even more pertinent for today is that he's also very applied. So he grapples very much with issues of methodology, data collection. He also is very applied in terms of what it means for policy and for practice as well. And this is also why we're very pleased to have Nancy Hay, who will be responding as the discussant, because she very much understands that translation between research and practice. Okay, so Paul is going to speak first for about 40 minutes, and then Nancy will respond for about 25 minutes, and then we will have time for questions and discussion. And what I do need to say is that everything is being recorded. So if you are asking questions and you don't want your identity to be known, you'll need to just make that clear when you ask the question, or if you want your question to be edited out, because this recording will be available publicly through the RSS website later on. Okay, first of all, Paul, thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Okay, wow. Good evening, everybody. Brilliant, thank you. There is an audience out there. Fantastic. So, I'll do this in about 40 minutes or so. I'm not an academic that talks for very much longer than the time I'm allowed, so you can expect it to last that long. And I won't use slides, so this will probably be one of the first RSS lectures that you've seen without data. There will be data, hopefully some of it coming from my mind, some of what I've written some notes on in case I forget the evidence. So the title of my talk is Wellbeing and Policy is all subjective. I'm going to start with a couple of minutes on 2,000 years of ethical discourse, but sort of brought us to 3 accounts of well-being that can be used to judge whether someone's life goes well or otherwise. And they're loosely called a needing, wanting and enjoying account. So the first account is an objectivist account of welfare. This is when we say that an individual's life goes well or better if they have things that we decide are good for them. So if they are better educated, if they are healthier, if they live longer, if they have good housing. Now, it's an objective list, but importantly, there are often subjective elements on the objective list. So, for example, Martha Nussbaum's objective list contains play. Life goes well for people when they play, as defined and expressed by themselves. We could also say that life goes well when people report feeling happy. Objectively, we decide that that's something that we decide as being good for people. So, importantly, to start with there, objective lists contain subjective measures often. Second account is a preference satisfaction account, desire fulfillment in the philosophical literature. And this is essentially that people's lives go better for themselves when they get more of the things that they desire, when you can satisfy more of your preferences. Economists are particularly interested in this account of welfare. Allows individuals to decide for themselves what's good for them. And economists will often, as many of you will know, will use income as a proxy for welfare. If you look at a basic microeconomics textbook, it will say utility, U is a function of Y, income. Importantly, when an economist is saying that, they're not really thinking that income in and of itself is utility and welfare, but all else equal, more income means an individual can satisfy more of their preferences. They can consume more, and consumption is part of the preferences of what people desire. So that's objective lists and preference satisfaction. The third account of welfare is a mental state account. This says that essentially someone's life goes better for themselves when they feel better, as measured through hedonic, typically measured through emotions, through feelings, through expressions or judgments sometimes of life going well as people feel it and enjoy it. And those 3 accounts can again, particularly preference and mental state accounts, can also be measured in subjective and objective ways. Right? So I could, for example, observe your revealed behaviours. There's no inquiry directly into anything subjectively that you say, only in what you do. Or I could ask you about your preferences, maybe over hypothetical scenarios that we might not yet have any evidence or data on, particularly for the purposes of informing policy. So that would be a subjective expression of a preference. With mental states, I could most simply ask you how you feel. Obviously, I'm going to say a little bit more about that during the course of this talk. And I could also look at your facial expressions, or look at your cortisol levels, or skin conductance as ways or proxies for how you're feeling that are objective measures in some substantive sense. So again, when we talk about the objective and the subjective, there's often a category confusion between the conceptualization of objectivity and the implementation of practical measurement. And I think it's obviously important, that we need to keep those two things apart from one another, that objective measures can contain subjective. And actually, even if you think about how we measure education levels and income, what do? We ask people to subjectively report on their levels of education and income, which are seen as objective indicators in some sense, but require often subjective measurement. So the boundaries between objectivity and subjectivity are very blurred, and often there's a lot of category confusion between them. Does anyone have a tattoo? Put your hand up if you have a tattoo. Now, you know, as you've been asked this as well, does it hurt? Right? Well, the answer, of course, to that question is it depends. Or context matters, as I often say when I was teaching behavioural science. depends on where your tattoo is, of course. It depends on how much you feel the pain. I've got 4 tattoos. People have asked me whether they hurt or not, and I say, well, I have absolutely no idea whether yours will. I'm very proud of that. In fact, I fell asleep during one. I feel very proud. But the point being is to know whether a tattoo hurts or not, or to know whether anything that we do to somebody in policy will make them feel a particular way. The only way to know that is to inquire directly into how much it hurts. Now, there are things that we can do to measure pain. We can look at pain selectors. We can see objectively some measures of pain. But if you go to the doctors and you say that you've got pain, one of the first things that they will ask you is how much it hurts. And it hurts as much as you subjectively feel it hurts. So there is something objective in having a tattoo. We can wear a tattoo in the same place, and objectively that tattoo is objectively in the same place, and we're doing something substantively that we can objectively observe as being a tattoo, or whatever it is, building a new road, or a park, or a hospital. But how we experience or feel about that intervention is subjective. Life is necessarily subjective. So sometimes people will use subjective as a pejorative term, particularly about happiness and well-being measures, which I'm going to spend obviously most of my time talking about. Oh, it's all subjective. And I'm like, that's the fucking point. It is subjective because life is a lived experience that is subjective. That is the point. Yeah, I can do lots of things and measure lots of things objectively about your conditions. And actually, in public policy, objective lists have formed a huge part of what we do in public policy. We make kids stay on school to learn to read and write, because we think it's important that they read and write. We allow them to satisfy their preferences through economic policy. We're constantly talking about GDP, growth or otherwise, as a measure of growth. Would seem that we ought to be paying some attention, more attention, certainly than we currently are, to mental states, to felt experience, to the subjective experiences of tattoos and transport and everything else that people experience in their day-to-day lives. Because that's the only way we're going to know whether and how much it hurts. So, it would seem a bit perverse. And I know you mentioned at the introduction that we're going to talk about happiness. We could talk about misery for a bit, because one of the things I think this is a really important observation in discussing well-being measurement around policymakers, is that there will often be, a sort of sometimes a little bit of a snigger around happiness, happiness in policy. But if you frame the language as misery reduction, you may actually be using precisely the same measures for measuring misery. It would be pathological for a policymaker to say, I'm not interested in reducing misery. Or sadistic for them to say on the behalf of their population, I want to see more suffering in the world than would otherwise be the case. Right. So I think from a framing, for policy discussion point of view, I think actually often using the language of suffering and misery is important. And of course that's what we do around mental health. It's exactly what we do when we discuss mental health and mental illness. We discuss that in the negative frame, depression, anxiety, and so on. And in health application, we do use measures of welfare to express whether and by how much people's lives are affected and could potentially be improved by intervention, using measures of self-report to some large degree. Although, how many of you are familiar with the QALY in health? Good QALYs. So, a QALY is a quality adjusted life year. It's an expression of the measure of benefit associated with an intervention where we take life years, which we assume to be good for us, the longer we live the better, and adjust them by the quality of life associated with each of those health states. I was involved in my early incarnation as a health economist a long time ago now, in the generation of the values that go into the quality assessments that are used by NICE and other agencies around the world to think about resource allocation decisions in healthcare. And they're based on people's preferences, imaginations essentially, over hypothetical future scenarios. And that's okay, it's better than doing nothing. It's better than allowing doctors to be judges of what's good for people. Better still, I would argue, would be to directly assess how much something affects somebody in the lived experiences of their lives. Because one of the things that we're not very good at doing, as individuals and as policymakers, is projecting and predicting future scenarios, future impact, future welfare. We are kind of all right at knowing how much, what it would feel like immediately. So, break my leg, maybe even experience some adverse mental health consequence. What would that be like initially? I'm not bad at doing that. But what I'm not very good at being able to do is to project how that's going to affect me into the future. Either through adaptation processes, i.e. getting used to stuff, which happens to most of the stimuli that we experience in our lives, or in some cases sensitization, the extent to which actually some things become worse the longer we experience them. And that's particularly true of mental health conditions compared to physical health conditions. So when you experience adverse mental health consequences, you don't get used to being depressed. Right? But you experience adverse physical health consequences in contrast, and actually you sort of get used to it. If you think about how we allocate healthcare resources, we actually always do it like it's the other way around, that actually physical conditions are much more significant in terms of their both impact and the longevity of the impact in comparison to mental health conditions. So one thing that many people have been arguing is that we should be paying more attention to the experiences of mental health, and in so doing, we would give greater priority to mental health conditions. And again, that's a subjective. That's subjective. I kind of want to be sort of reclaiming this language of subjectivity. Is this all subjective? Yes, exactly. That is exactly the point. That's what mental health conditions are. They are subjective experiences. So, one I'm going to move on to, in the interest of time, is to discuss a few things around measuring subjective well-being, and sort of think about what we should be measuring, because we're going to use these measures of subjective experience. We need to have some questions. A few years ago now, I guess it must be a decade ago nearly now, the Office of National Statistics approached Richard Dolan and me to essentially write them some questions. Now, Richard is a great advocate of wellbeing measures and also, of course, for increased funding going to mental health. Been incredibly successful in that regard. Richard is very much a fan of the most widely used question in wellbeing measurement, which is essentially overall how satisfied are you with your life. And so, had Richard alone been consulted in this exercise, the ONS would have the ONS 1. And it would be life satisfaction. Because I was an awkward bugger, I thought it was a bit, wellbeing is a little bit more than whether you just feel satisfied to what extent. So could we ask a second question? Is Paul, that's what Paul had earlier. Where are you, Paul? Hello, Paul. And so we said, can we ask, if you're going to ask one question, could we ask a second? And so, as a precursor to what I then subsequently went on to do, to some large extent it happens by design, is to kind of make a case for why we should be looking at purpose and meaning and more directly in experiences than in the ONS questions. We got the question in there, which is about how worthwhile the activities that you engage in. So because the ONS said we could have two questions, we had a third one. Actually, if you're going to have three, you might as well have four. And then there are two more questions in the ONS 4 that ask about your happiness yesterday and how anxious you felt yesterday. So a more directly experiential, although it's an evaluative question about experience of yesterday. So a question that asks about how happy you felt yesterday, a question that asks about how anxious you felt. It's important that we get the negative experiences in there as well. And because it is possible for you to report yourself as having felt both happy and anxious. You have now a more complete set of questions that can be used by the ONS and of course other bodies and agencies that maybe Nancy might say something about in her Discussant role, that have been using these questions more widely in application. And I think you've got in those questions as I say, a richer and more complete sense of what well-being is. And it's interesting if you go back to the introduction about the accounts of welfare. The preference satisfaction is an account of whether you're getting more of the things that you desire. Preference satisfaction, notice the word, desire fulfillment. The life satisfaction question is sort of a hybrid of a mental state account and a preference satisfaction account. Probably more a preference satisfaction account. Right? It's to the extent to which you feel like your life is satisfied, the extent to which you feel like you have maybe achieved or accomplished and can tick off the things that would be expected of you to have lived your life well or to be living well. The experience-based measures, happiness yesterday, anxiety yesterday, are more closely aligned with the mental state account by being an assessment of how things feel day to day or moment to moment as you live and breathe your life. So that's a good thing, and we can start looking at some interesting differences between those different measures. Time to elaborate on those at any great length. I will do what I was going to do at the beginning, so that I don't forget anybody that I should thank. I'll do that now, because I'm going to talk about some data that come from different collaborators, and I'd like to thank Amanda Henwood, George Cavassos, Chris Krekel, Laura Kudrina and Luke Schneider for generating lots of the evidence and discussions and data, not just data, but conversations, discussions, and helping my thinking over these last many years. And also to Danny Kahneman, Richard Layard, Andrew Oswald and Kat Sunstein, who have also been shaping and helped to shape a lot of what I think about these issues. So that's got the thanks out of the way for that being recorded. Good, now I can slack them off. One of the things that Laura and I found looking at data on experiences from the American Time study, this is not the ONS question, where we have more direct data on how people are feeling in the experiences of their life, is that there's a relationship with age that suggests that actually people report very low levels of purpose in their 20s. Which kind of increases a little bit to the 30s and then sort of levels off a bit. In contrast to the life satisfaction data, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, which shows a U-shape. Which shows that basically I, as a 51-year-old man, have hit the nadir and am about to get happy, according to the life satisfaction measure. All of my life until now. So that's what old people can take comfort in. All you young people, you've got the misery to come. You're going down the curve. Us old kids are all going up the other end until the last 6 months of their life was pretty miserable before dying. But you get a very, very consistent pattern of usage across almost any data set that you look at on life satisfaction around the world, very robust U-shape. Doesn't show up quite to the same extent, in fact, maybe not at all in experiential data. That's kind of interesting. It should be exploring a bit more fully some of those differences. So we need more data on experiences. We need to be looking much more on other. I'll say much more. I'll say a little bit more about that. I think it might conclude remarks. There are some questions about what's measured. There are some questions about how it's measured. How should we be asking people these questions? And we, with George, we looked at a paper we had called Happy Talk. We looked at the ONS questions answered either face-to-face or over the telephone. And unfortunately, it's not a randomised controlled trial, so we have some issues around inferring causality there. But people are a lot happier on the phone. People are a lot happier. They're answering, aren't they? Right. So you've got a selection effect of when you pick up. And in an interview, when you've got an interview interviewer sitting in front of you and you're telling them how shit your life is, hard to say I'm really happy afterwards. On the phone, a lot easier. These are big effects. These are big effects. This is about the effect of having no education to having a degree. When you compare face-to-face to telephone interviews. So one, if anyone's interested in improving well-being in the population, ask people on the phone. That's probably that's one of the most important insights that you can gain from this evening. And also the determinants of happiness matter, according to whether it's phone or face-to-face, right? So for example, education doesn't matter in terms of its effects on the phone, but has a positive effect in face-to-face interviews. So we need to be a bit cautious. When people are making international comparisons particularly, which is something that people like doing a lot of, which countries are the happiest, look into the ways in which the surveys have been conducted, and you might start explaining some, and probably not all, but at least some of the effects that you might observe across different populations. All right? All good? Everyone happy? It depends how you ask it. I'll phone you up and ask you how happy you are. Now, I want to talk a little bit about, and I'm going to do two more things in the next 20 minutes or so. I'm going to talk about using subjective wellbeing as a guide to policy, and then I'm going to move on to maybe think about what the next steps might be, how we might be using some of the data and ways in which we gather. So, as a guide for policy, well, it could actually be used as a guide for individuals to decide on their own policies for their lives. So I don't really need to always necessarily think about, we're asking happiness questions, what's the public policy implications of this? Actually, what's the useful pieces of information that I might gather from this myself? Laura, who works on happiness by design, sort of lived her life according to some of the evidence and the principles that come out of it. I find that a bit weird, but there are ways in which you could use those. I mean, some of you may be aware that I gave a talk at the Hay Festival in May and said that single women without children are doing just fine. In fact, in some data sets are actually certainly healthier than their single, than their married counterparts. Basically marriage is good for men, but less good for women. There was a huge amount of interest. The most interest I've ever had in anything I've ever said. And it's interesting that people are interested in that. It's interesting that a lot of people don't like that. And that speaks directly to what I talk about in Happy Ever After and about the narratives that we're expected to live to be happy in some sense, which actually for some people aren't what will make them happy. So we're going to use some of this data to sort of make judgments about, whether they might act in particular ways, or at least if they're not going to do that, because, again, I have to say this caveat for the camera, no randomised controlled trials. I haven't actually allocated people to having children or not, so the causal inference is difficult. Doesn't make headlines that. But at least you might not be so surprised if you have children and they make you fucking miserable. Doesn't come as a big shock. Because there's lots of other people out there who feel exactly the same. Now, alright, that's how I talk about kids. Mine, for the record now, they're older and they're making me a lot happier than their babies. So we could use this data for individuals, and particularly, for example, about job choice. Now again, causal evidence is really hard to find, but if there's suggestive evidence that particular types of careers and occupations might be ones that might make you feel a bit better in them, you might use that as a guide to some degree about what kinds of jobs you might take, or at least you might not be so surprised if you take a job and you feel it's good or happy. Now, I will say something about the policy impact, and Chris Crecker, who's sitting here, I should mention some of the work that we did, looking at the impact of the 2012 games on, this paper we had published earlier this year, Public Economics, looking at the impact of the 2012 games on well-being in London, Paris and Berlin. 2011, 2012 and 2013 in London, Paris and Berlin, and we looked at whether there was any effect of the games. And there was a big effect of hosting the games. Danny Boyle's opening ceremony, do you remember that? It was amazing, wasn't it? It was amazing, what an amazing spectacle. That lifted happiness, however we measured it, significantly. And it's sort of stayed like that a little bit during the games, you know, it's kind of a nice effect. It didn't really have much of an effect of what happened during the games, but, you know, a big effect of hosting the event. Didn't last very long though, didn't last until the next year. But big impact in that year. And one of the things that we're able to do with those data is to start estimating essentially sort of compensating income amounts around those wellbeing changes. So, for example, Daniel Fujiwara has done a lot of work in this area that many of you will be familiar with, where you have an effect of an intervention, in this case, games. You know the wellbeing consequences of that. You have either data within that study or separate data that you estimate the effect of income on wellbeing. And then you can calculate the compensating amount of money that would compensate you for the change in wellbeing. And in the Olympic Games, we estimated that implicit willingness to pay to be around sort of 5 billion. There's quite a big error on that, but sort of around 5 billion quid. Actual cost of the games, well, it kept going up a day, didn't it? 9.3 billion. Now, you can say it's not worth it, but I love London 2012. And our confidence intervals just about cover, goes up to about 9.5 billion. So it's just about cover the 9.3 billion that the Olympics cost. So I reckon it was worth it. Of course, my co-authors and colleagues and more dry, boring economists like it less. But it gives you an indication, and as I say, Daniel's work too, and other people's, give you an indication of how we might start using some of this evidence and information to inform policy decisions, to decide whether something is worth it or not. And we might not have to rely only, or even at all, on people's willingness to pay as imaginations of what the impact of a condition or an experience might be. Because remember that we're not very good at predicting that when I talked about that earlier. We're not very good at being able to predict or forecast how things will affect us in the experience. So we might start being able to use some of this data in those ways. And in the end, perhaps, we might actually do away with money at all in cost-benefit analysis. Because if we were able to rank all policy interventions according to their wellbeing impact, we could then use scarce resources up until the point they run out, up until the point at which we've decided that's the shadow price of wellbeing, essentially, the language we refer to economists. That would be the point at which we would stop spending public resources. We're a long way away from that. We're a long way away from that. What we need, would you expect any academic to say this research is needed? Some money is nice as well. But we also need, obviously, more data. And I'm going to then move on for the remainder of this talk, I think, to talk a little bit about what those next steps and data would be, I think. One of the things that I'm interested in as working in essentially doing behavioural science and nudges and shoves to change people's behaviour to act in particular ways, and also working in happiness and wellbeing, is that those two worlds probably don't actually suit one another very much. Nowhere near as much as you might expect them to, given that how we feel is an important antecedent of what we do, and what we do has a really significant effect on how we feel. So there is a very clear and obvious dynamic relationship between what we do and how we feel, what we do and how we feel, and how we feel and what we do. And one of the reasons I think why there hasn't been so much research in that is because often the methods of analysis will be quite different from the wellbeing researchers compared to the behavioural science researchers. Where in behavioural science, lots of randomised controlled trials, lots of causal influence. Wellbeing research, lots of data sets of various kinds, some of it longitudinal, where we try to infer causality from data that isn't causal. So one very obvious thing to do is to put wellbeing measures in to randomised controlled trials as a consequence and as a cause of the behaviour change. So to go back to where I started, it's all subjective. I'd like to know, when I'm doing my nudges, that I'm actually making people better off. Rather than just knowing, because I know what's good for people, I might as well just use an objectivist account. I might as well not bother worrying about whether people's lives are improved actually in their experience if I know what's good for them. So actually a lot of what the behavioural interventions do is sort of tick off whether someone's changing the way that you expect them to, or that they ought to, without any inquiry at all into whether that actually shows up in any experience. One of the things that various people are working on at the moment, including Discussant and Cathie Marsh and myself, is looking at actually the value of information, whether people are actually, better off when they find out stuff. One of the things that Cass says in his talks is about popcorn labelling, when you get the calorie labels in popcorn in the cinema. I want to know. I know it's shit, so I'm eating it in the cinema. Right? So there actually could be negative welfare consequences of information that's provided to nudge people to behave in particular ways. It's at least interesting to find out. We're actually doing a study where we're looking at people's facial expressions when they see the calories on the popcorn. Next time I give a talk, I'll be able to tell you more about what we find, what we found in that. But it's at least interesting, and I would say more than that, policy relevant, that we find out much more about how people feel as a result of being nudged in particular directions. And actually, it would give us some very, very useful insight. I think your watch is for outside. I'll start in nearly 10. You want 40 minutes?
I thought you down as finishing at 6:45, which gives you another 5 minutes.
Oh, okay. I thought we started after that.
I'm sure Nancy could expand to fill the gap.
We should at least be finding out. And that will then start giving us some very important insight into why some of what we think people ought to be doing might not actually be making them feel better. People talk about obesity as being a significant challenge. Well, actually, associations, again, not that we don't have randomised controlled trials, but correlationally, you need very significant increases in weight for that to affect your well-being. Little wonder then that people actually don't care very much. People may sometimes be stupid. A lot of behavioural science is about how we make mistakes and errors, but we're not that stupid. If we don't get the feedback, often directly, that things are making us feel good or otherwise bad, then we have no reason for action. And so understanding that relationship between well-being and behaviour is absolutely central and critical. Another thing that we should do is that's kind of essentially randomised controlled trials where we're getting causal inference about well-being, where we're measuring the reciprocal relationship between behaviour and well-being. One of the things I've said many times over many years is that I'd like to find out how happy someone is without asking them. Because we have a reactivity effect in self-report data. We're doing some work where we're using technology to see whether we can gather passive data that would be a representation of the ground truth of people's well-being. At the moment, we're not finding very much. That's not to say that in the fullness of time we won't. And if I came back and gave another lecture here again, that would be something that I will be able to speak more directly to. I think is what passive data tell us about people's well-being without having to directly ask them. So I think that's an important issue. I've said a little bit about the focusing much more on the experiences, and that does two things. It means that you sort of read happy by design, because that gives you insights in how to do that for yourself, and you read happy ever after, because that will then draw your attention to some of the narratives and stories that people might be living, that draw them away from the experiences that they have in their lives. So that's a minute you've got 30 seconds used on planning two books. What I am going to do for the remaining time that I thought I had is to talk about a focus on misery. I'm going to end with misery because that's where I think we ought to be paying much more attention. And one of the things that the ONS questions allow us to do is to look at who reports the lowest levels of well-being. And not just on a life satisfaction measure, or any one measure, because you all know that any one response to one question could be mistaken. Trembling hand theories and the like, stochastic measures where you're just, you met to give yourself, you get 5 and then you get coded in a particular way. When you've got 4 measures, arguably you've got more robust measurement of how well or badly people are doing. And one of the things that we've done with the ONS questions is to look at who reports the lowest levels of wellbeing across all 4 ONS questions, as defined by the categories that the ONS use to say who's in the worst levels of wellbeing. And you find some interesting results there. Importantly, you get something different than you would if you only focused on one of those measures. But what it enables us to do, and I think this is really important for the wellbeing in policy, is to identify clusters of people who are doing badly. And some of these are really obvious clusters. Some of these are, poor health or unemployed or whatever. But self-employed people come out as a cluster that are significant, more likely to report being in the most miserable group. And that's interesting because they may be a population group that will fall between the cracks of different areas of policy and also other measures of welfare that we might use to judge whether their lives are going well or not. So I think that's something that's really significant in the use of subjective data, because that's what I want to know. I want to know who is suffering. I want to know why they're suffering, and I want to know what I can do about their suffering, and I want to be able to measure the impact of my interventions on their suffering. And we can only do that if we inquire directly into people's subjective experiences. And if we know something about how they report on their lives as they live and breathe it and experience it, and not only according to how they think they ought to, and not only how we think they ought to. Because our judgments that we make about other people, not just in our personal lives, not just in terms of how we might view women who have never married and children, but as policymakers, how we judge how people ought to be living their lives in ways that we think would be good for them. As parents, I mean, God, doesn't every parent say they want their kids to be happy? They don't really mean that. They should be finishing that sentence, I want my kids to be happy, doing the things that I think they ought to be doing in order to be happy. That's what most parents actually really mean. And that's what most policymakers mean when they say, I want people to be doing well according to doing the things that I think they ought to be doing in order to live a life to live well. Take that last bit off the sentence, and as parents, practitioners, and policymakers, we should be seeking to minimise the misery that our kids and those that we care for and service experience day to day as they live and breathe their lives. We can only do that by direct assessment of subjective experience. Thank you.
I will use slides, mainly to be different to Paul, really. And I will start on misery. There are about 500,000 people in the country who score low on all 4 of those questions Paul described. There's about 2.3 million people in the country who have very low life satisfaction, and about 10.4 million people in the country who have very high anxiety. Quite a lot of people. And that's on the very low bits of the spectrum. So we also, in Britain, are very much more comfortable with misery. We have a minister, or have had a minister for loneliness, and a minister for suicide reduction or prevention. We're quite happy with misery, and we're less happy with happiness. But I'll have a go. One question I think, especially hearing Paul talk, is I think we do need a question about pain, and the experience of pain would be my addition to that. So I'm going to do. I'm really conscious that I am a policy official and I'm not a statistician or researcher tonight. And so everything I say comes with that proviso. So I'm going to come very much from the policy is a team sport. And it genuinely is. So as a policy official, evidence informed is what we aim for. Having an awesome statistician, which I have been absolutely privileged to have worked with, economists, communications people, legal advisors, ministers, operational delivery colleagues, the works, is absolutely essential if we're going to deliver successful policy, public policy in the UK. And this is an example of the bits of things you need to know. And evidence, and in fact data and statistics, is like one little chunk of that evidence bit. And the reason why I said evidence informed is one of the problems I had as a policy official is that the evidence never quite sat with the minister. And they were like, well, that's just not how I experience it in my constituency surgeries. And they had a whole load of other experience that they were relying on. And one of the reasons they like the wellbeing data is it does pick up on a lot of this experience. So I want to say thank you to all the awesome analysts I've worked with over the years and continue to have the pleasure of doing that with. So why do I care about this? When I came into policy making, I was astonished with how far away from reality the discussions and decisions were. I was designing publicly funded legal services, and there was no recognition that you might be in personal crisis when you were trying to engage with legal services. Maybe you were about to lose your license, and therefore your job, and therefore your home and partner, etc. And actually, perhaps a leaflet about legal advice was not going to hit the cuttings. So it took me into this space of trying to understand that experience much more solidly. So we were in the realm of customer insight, which is much more marketing-y terms, design thinking, working with design council, using behavioural insights, user experience, broad range of academic research to inform our policy thinking. And I've got some examples here of the sorts of things we did and still use and are trying to bring into policy making. It's really, really hard to do. So intuitively, as a human being, I get that the experience of voting or being a juror or being a victim or witness in a trial or whatever else I'm doing my tax return, is not a particularly good one or pleasant one. But trying to get a whole system to shift and do that is really hard. But my basic point here is people are people. And going back to one of Paul's points was, what are we nudging people towards? And so well-being is one of those things. The problem with well-being is people think it's really fluffy. When I go and talk to people about well-being, often they'll go, oh, it's not about candles. And so this is, people have an image problem. So this is what people think of when they think of well-being. They think of wellness, they think of the apple, of leaping for joy. I mean, other positive emotions are available here. We don't have to worry about that one. Women doing yoga is an often a classic one. It's quite a gendered view. So it is really fluffy. And one of the things I'm talking about today, I think, is sort of translating literally. I think health kind of got there quite a long way, so this salutogenic type approach. So we often talk about well-being and GDP, but actually we also talk about health and life expectancy as the sort of goal for policy making in another part of government. And that's great. And it talks about sort of aiming for something positive, which is great, and it's just really hard to do, turns out. The other thing is that this well-being has a really technical conversation happening too. It's about the purpose of a charity or government. It's about using outcomes. These are very ones like health, education, housing, often very positively framed outcomes, and have billions of indicators, lots and lots of indicators. And you can have a discussion of the indicator world, and you're sat there going, oh God, how does that relate to my personal life and what I'm trying to do to improve, I don't know, consular services in the Foreign Office? But this is being used around the world. This is like serious stuff. Like loads of countries have really serious well-being frameworks. There are major discussions happening. They're growing all over the place. So we're back on then and say, okay, what does the Treasury think it is? Well-being is the goal of, well, why are we trying to do things? Treasury have said, well, what's the job of government? Well, it's to make life better. And they use the words welfare economics, social welfare, social value, or well-being, probably fairly synonymously. And so we're moving towards what I think we call wellbeing economics, which is what the all-party parliamentary group was called, who were campaigning for this broader set of measures. Okay, that's great. What does that mean? Well, okay, it's making a difference to people's lives. So it's looking at the broader range of impacts, the full range of intervention impacts, not just economic ones. It means looking at health, relationships, security and purpose in our thinking about policy making. And crucially, and I'll come back to this right at the end, Where appropriate, evaluations and interventions should be used to use in your policy making, which is where we get to the RCT bit that Paul was talking about. So that's what we're trying to do, trying to make a difference to people's lives. And we have this amazing data in the UK, like properly amazing, but it is objective and subjective. So what does this data tell you? I'm really conscious I'm about to use data really probably totally badly in front of an audience that knows what they're talking about. This is how policy officials use their data. Firstly, wellbeing isn't about, the wellbeing data is telling quite a good story, and that's pretty hard. But we know that's not quite the case. And how do you know? You actually do have to ask people. How many times has someone said, how are you doing? And you're fine. Or you've asked someone, and you've seen them, they look like they're doing brilliantly, but under the water they are swimming furiously to keep up. They've had an absolutely disastrous day, and you have to ask people how they are actually doing. And we kind of know that. What do you get if you ask? You get lots of pretty pictures. You get the picture of the UK, this weirdly happy Northern Ireland, the darker colours are happy. Some weird blob in the middle of, I think, York there, and miserable cities. You see all these things, which is quite exciting. You see other cool data, some surprising good news, which everyone goes, why? It feels like everything's going to hell in a handcart, but why is it getting better according to the data? That's a really good question, but I think it's quite hard to explain, but we're getting there. And you can play with this at a local level. You can compare local authorities. I've just picked some that happen to be the community wellbeing local authorities for the LGA to show them what was going on in their area. So you can see some cool stuff. It's fun. And you can also see it used in toilets. You can see it used at the Gatwick security. You can see people saying, how satisfied are you with your experience of our train or bus journey today? So we can see these sort of satisfaction measures exploding. TfL, quite good for them, identifying stress points in services. We can see the often criticism I get is, oh, that's not well-being, it's not asking all the psychological dimensions. And you can go ahead, ask these wonderful psychological dimensions. Loads of great ones out there. And then this is the Twitter this was projected onto the Sheffield town hall of saying this is how people feel in real time using Twitter data. And there's lots of great ways to start understanding it. And we're trying to make some sense of what all this tells us in the round in a practical way. So it's cool stuff, loads of cool data. What does it tell us? It tells us what we already knew. A lot of common sense. But actually, some of this no shit Sherlock stuff is important because actually people didn't know it as well as they thought they did. And actually, we need reminding, and you'll see why in a minute. This is the U-shaped curve. Midlife crisis is real. You peak at 23 and 68 and bottom out in your 40s and 50s. Sorry. But what's interesting about this, and this is just like looking at patterns in that data, you get that antidepressants with age. It peaks, flips the frown the other way up. And this is suicide rate. People who've died by suicide by age as well. And you can see that peak at 45 to 49 and 50 to 54. So there is something in this that is more useful than just that, oh yeah, it's tough in midlife crisis territory. We can also see some of this with the 5 ways to wellbeing. So this is mental wellbeing stuff. Look at that dip in connect in midlife. Sort of echoes that U shape as well. And what are we doing then? We're working. So I'll come back to that in a second. This is the pleasure purpose stuff. I probably ought to actually reference this way better than I'm doing. Thank you very much for this. We love this. So this is the fact that when you're young, for teenagers, it's all about the pleasure. Is that right? For when you're getting into middle age, the opposite is true. And then this later life bit, 68, it's pleasure and purpose. So thank you so much for this. But there's some funny things that happen if you buck that trend and it's more about purpose for you when you're younger, which looks interesting. But what it allows us to do is have a look in the round at these relative effect sizes about what makes a big difference and what doesn't. And these are really broad brush blobs at the moment. This is proper policy communication of data here. So we can tell that these things seem to really help. Partner relationships, someone to rely on, trust, and having a job. These things also help, but they're smaller. So this is music, physical activity, access to green space, the quality of your work. So having a job is good, a good quality job is way better. And the same on the negative side, noise pollution, air pollution, longer commute, lower quality of work. And often, if you benefit from the job, you'll cope with the noise pollution and the air pollution. And then the other things we know, the misery inducers, loneliness, poor health, basic needs, unemployment. Having a child in the middle, on average, it doesn't make a difference, but when the kids are under 5 or they're teenagers, it's pretty tough. And after a master's degree, it gets worse, sorry. So, what we find when we look at the evidence is, how do you compare across health, education, economic policy, housing policy, all these different areas? How do you make sense of this? Actually, needs to get some consistency of those metrics. And we had a look at those drivers of well-being, how they apply in a local area and what data is currently available. And you can start to do this for every local authority of the UK. Not quite sure what it tells us yet, but you can. So this is about translating it into context that makes sense. And we can do the same in the workplace. And we can have a look at the workplace drivers of well-being. What commonly used questions are they? So we can get beyond this, oh, actually, we should just ban email out of hours. Well, actually, that applies to office jobs. Perhaps it might not apply if you're trying to deliver babies 365 days of the year. You do need people 24/7. So actually understanding the context that you're working in and the wellbeing factors that relate to that is really important. So this has been quite impressive, and it's been taken up in a shorter form on these voluntary reporting standards for wellbeing in the workplace. And this was designed by businesses and adopted for them to start using those questions you'll see there. So this is understanding how you might use it in a business as an organisation to report how people are doing. And at a national level, we've also used the evidence around wellbeing at work to inform national job quality measures as part of the industrial strategy. And I think, indeed, if you look at the Industrial Strategy Council metrics, they also now include those subjective, life satisfaction in particular, as well as social trust and health satisfaction. So, where does that take us into what works, right? For whom, when, how much is what we're trying to get to. So we are the What Works Centre for Wellbeing. We work with government, with charities, with business and academia to try and make sense of all of this, to work out what you can do with policies, projects, programmes and approaches. So we know quite a lot at the individual level. Paul's work does a really good job of trying to get that out there. We know probably quite a lot at an international level, but this middle bit is kind of where we live a dual life. We know what it's like in practice, but actually we get into the office, we do something completely different. And we're trying to make some sense of it as part of this What Works network. And we work with a large number of universities across the UK, businesses and charities to try and do it. And we found a huge amount of evidence. We looked at, you're not meant to be able to read this, but the idea is that there is lots. We looked at over 20 different systematic reviews, huge amounts of global evidence, pulling together what seems to make a difference, no difference, or positive or negative for different people. What we did find, I think the academic answer is more research is needed, but fill the evidence gaps, please. This was on sport and dance in the UK for young people. And actually a lot of this activity is underway. It's a good thing to do by many accounts, but we don't have a lot of research. We found 8 studies, of which most were from other countries. That's really silly. For something that is really, in theory, good for your well-being, and looks like it in lots of ways, we don't study it properly. So fill the gaps is where we are. So we're in the space of measuring and using those questions in evaluations. And actually they've been used in lots of different places. And we have that, this is the guidance for charities, but it's used in a range of different contexts. You can use those personal wellbeing questions, the social capital ones, and loneliness now in your evaluations. But, go back one, there are some issues. Actually, using this in practice is really hard. And there is quite a lot of methodological development still to do. And interestingly, no one seems to like paying for methodological development. Even NICE, I don't think, has a methodology budget. And that's a lot of money being spent elsewhere. It takes quite a long way from these questions. These questions don't move very fast. And often you need to move into smaller domains to actually see the difference. So actually the social connection ones seem to be really useful in looking at what drives well-being. It's really uncomfortable to ask these questions in evaluations. That's the one thing that people come up to us and go, oh, I really don't know how to ask these. And the most popular bit of our loneliness guidance was how to ask these questions. It feels a bit difficult. Actually, people don't mind being asked them. It's asking them that feels a bit awkward. We do need to know the objective stuff too. But we also need to know if doing that objective stuff matters. And we also get into questions like the environment and well-being. How do you understand the well-being of oceans? One of the jobs I had to do was understanding a cost-benefit analysis of the changes to the electoral system. How does this help with that in practice? And the question I was asked by a permanent secretary this week was, how would we organise government if well-being was a goal? And I didn't quite yet have the answer to that. But I think my overview of this thing is that well-being in itself is a team sport. We need our analytical and research community to do it. We need people to have a go and get done with this. We need people to be thinking about the practical implications of this and the ethics of it as well as we move into the future. So that is it on policy.
Thank you. I'm Andrew Lloyd Kendall from the British Medical Association. I've got a question about, I suppose, social cost and externalities, really. So I'm happiest when I drink a lot. I eat a lot of popcorn in the cinema like you, Paul. I sit in front of the TV and binge watch Netflix for like 3 days in a go. Unfortunately, all my actions have an externality on other people. So it's not very helpful, speaking as someone who represents doctors, to have a huge cost on the NHS and on society, productivity and so on, just because I'm doing something that personally makes me happier. So it's how do you trade off, as a policy question, individual happiness with sort of society benefit?
Should we take another question as well? Thank you.
Nice to have started with an easy one.
Easier question. Trade-offs.
So yeah, it's a super difficult question. I mean, that's the first thing to say. I mean, there will always be a trade-off between, to some degree, individual and social welfare. A couple of things to say. First of all, when we do things for and with other people, we're generally happier, both with other people and also for. So there's a huge amount of personal benefit that comes from pro-sociality. So and I don't think we do enough in policy to make that transparent and salient to people. We would have much more pro-sociality if we did. The externalities are really interesting. Can I just take a couple of minutes on obesity? Because that is, as you know, one of the things that people always say. It's costing the NHS, whatever, billions of pounds every year. The number just gets made up to be larger each time. And I'm not aware of any proper counterfactual analysis of what would happen if all those fat people were skinny. And lived a lot longer, because we also have a huge social care crisis for people that are skinny and old. And actually, probably, if you did that analysis, if anyone were to do that properly, it would be very unclear and almost likely that obesity saves the NHS money rather than costs it. But we don't like that narrative, because that's a reason to allow us to judge people. So sometimes we might. I'm not saying you do this, of course, you're a very good doctor, but that sometimes we jump spuriously, potentially, to the consequences that our behaviours have for other people. And besides, we don't only care about exchequer cost anyway, because if we did, we'd be encouraging people to smoke, kids to smoke particularly, right? Because of course they would die earlier and not claim pensions. So we need to be, I think it's just important that we kind of step back and properly analyse, first of all, what consequences you are having for other people. And secondly, as a normative question, which we can't ever answer from empirical data, really, I don't think, unless you're inquiring into preferences, how people feel about which types of externality ought to be accounted for in public policy. We could say that because you've got lots of friends, you should be given greater priority over somebody who has few friends. There's a very good argument to be made for that, although a lot of people might not think that's acceptable for policy purposes. So I think we need to do both of those things. Be clear about the analysis of spillover and about the normative judgments that we make about which ones count.
I think it's a great question. So I can just come on this, because I recently was asked to how we understand the wellbeing impacts of access to high-speed broadband, and effectively, what is the social value of access to Netflix, right? And if you, I mean, arguably, you spend your evening watching Netflix, you're not out at the pub, you're not socialising, there's other things you're not doing. If you don't go to the town, you do a shopping online or whatever it is you're doing, you're not necessarily socialising. So there's not, the question there is it a good thing to have access to Netflix and those types of things? But that's good. We are really bad at predicting how we will actually feel, so that's one of the things that's quite important. And also the definition of well-being used by the ONS is how we're doing as individuals, as communities, and as the nation, and how sustainable it is for the future. So arguably, if health and how you feel about your health is one of the strongest determinants of overall life satisfaction, if you do a whole lot of things that will damage that in the future, that's not necessarily that sustainable. The other discussion that's happening is around what's the idea of living well together and community well-being, what does that mean to live well together? And this idea about, you need to be careful about double counting and things like this, but the wider effects. So I think the example you give, Paul, is the effects of a family, on the family of someone being very ill or dying in various different difficult ways. And actually that's the same, we're looking at that in relation to community effects of various things. And that's quite interesting and takes you into a quite complicated area. But I think people are trying to answer these questions.
Thank you. Jagan, Surrey University. It's very encouraging to see that policy is directed towards increasing well-being. However, the evidence I have seen about universal credit indicates that it makes people desperately insecure, unhappy, anxious, indebted, and thoroughly miserable. It even is supposed to have caused people death through excess stress in being sanctioned under that scheme. So my question is, if policy is towards making people's well-being better, why hasn't universal credit been abolished?
Go on.
So this is really tricky. So every time I've seen a minister stand up and say our goal is well-being or mental health for that matter, the response is always, well, you can't possibly be doing that if you're doing X policy here or Y policy there. And so that's part of the reason why I think we have misery ministers rather than happiness ministers. So that's one thing. Government is massive, public policy is massive, and our society is massive, and it's very easy to do one thing on one hand and the other thing on the other hand. I think one of the questions we should also be asking, if government's goal is genuinely to reduce misery and promote happiness, is what things should we stop doing? And I don't think we ask that often enough.
No, and I think, I mean, obviously, you know, in practice, policies are decided upon and then the evidence is gathered to support them, or not, as is often the case. And of course, once the tanker of policy has left the shipyard, it's very difficult to bring it back to dock, in fact.
So that assumes that you decide what to do, you start it, you follow it all through, and you deliver it. That's just not how policy is made, though. And policy is problem solving in a public context, and it doesn't follow follow that problem solving cycle. So very easily, you started one thing, and then the minister changes, and somebody else comes in, and they go, "Okay, I want to revisit it." You go, "Well, you can't. We're in the Lords. The bill's already there." I mean, like, well, actually, I don't care. We're going to do this now. And you're like, "Oh no, we're already in an implementation phase. Minister X did this," and actually, it's a very different. It's a moving feast constantly, and public policy is determined a large part by what governments and ministers want, and governments and ministers are elected by the public, and the media shapes that too. And we are the public and the media and politics, and we forget that.
Well, there are some policies that there are, high-level ideological positions, for example, that would be continued through particular ministers that would manifest themselves in some incarnation of that sort of policy. And I think that universal credit is probably an example of that.
Any other Thank you. So, lady in the middle here, and then the gentleman at the back.
I have a question about measurement and a comment. So you made the comment about single mothers being happy. I should have mentioned it first. I'm a researcher in the field of learning disability from UCL, and actually we have quite a lot of evidence that mothers and fathers of children with learning disabilities are as happy as mothers and fathers of children without disabilities, despite the fact there's also plenty of evidence that they are significantly more likely to suffer from a number of mental health problems like anxiety, depression, and so on. So that was a comment. But my question really is about, you mentioned that you would be interested in measuring subjective well-being without asking people because there's a response bias. And to take this further, I'm interested in your thoughts about how do you measure well-being from people who cannot self-report. So in my field, the interest is how do we actually measure well-being from people who might not have the same cognitive capacities to report on their well-being, and there's a question on can they actually conceptualize well-being in the same way? And from a policy perspective, does it matter if we're not measuring, or if we cannot measure well-being from this part of the population? So my field is learning disability, but it could equally apply to other fields like dementia and so on.
Yeah, it's a good question. I was talking to someone on the way in who works for charities with using the wellbeing measures in younger people who obviously have cognitive difficulties answering, survey questions. The ONS questions I think can go down to sort of secondary school kids, but not into primary school kids. So there will be questions about how we measure well-being of those that can't self-report, and also even those that can self-report who might not be in the surveys. I mean, I think that's really important. One of the issues around homeless people, for example, in our household panel surveys don't contain homeless people. So there's questions around both people that can't report and also those that never make it into the survey in the first place. And again, arguably, of course, that's where a lot of policy efforts should be directed. So it's of course an important challenge. I don't know which particular conditions, I'm not an expert in those areas, but which particular conditions people are unable to report their own levels of happiness and well-being in.
This is a brilliant question, and I'm really interested in your findings because that's not what I would have expected, so I'd like to see it. We are working with charities at the moment who are working with people with learning disabilities. Those ONS4 questions have been translated into a range of literally translated into versions that have been tested with people with disabilities. So the Spirit of 2012 Trust use these questions in all of their grant making. They use Invest in Happiness as their purpose, and they've done a lot of work on the back of the Paralympic Games on disability. So there are versions that can be used, but I think there are challenges, and we've got a whole blog series with charities who in this area who've been trying to work out how to do this. I think it's really important. So the family justice system makes decisions in the best interest of the child, but how do they know what that is? There is a Social Services Act in Wales now, which is around the well-being of the person concerned, and it's not clear to me how they make those decisions. And likewise, in Ofsted framework, it's up to inspectors to decide what is good well-being within that educational context. And I don't know if, yes, we can sense it and feel it and all those sorts of things, and that we can be reasonably good in our judgments, but actually we should test. And so this is one of the questions I think is a gap, and a methodological one that I think is important to try and at least have a go at.
Thank you. My name's Rob. I'm from a little provincial research team in West Sussex Council, so nothing national there. And I know a lot of people here could probably ask you dozens of questions for hours, so I'll try and make this entertaining for them, though it is a bit selfish. I've got sort of one directed to each of you, if that's okay, because they're both specifically related to things that I've been working on a little bit. To Paul, the idea about measuring well-being, I don't know if you're familiar with the Children's Society and the work they do around measuring children's well-being. The Good Childhood Index is some work that they've been putting out for the last 5 or 6 years at least. And they've put together some metrics involving something they call the Cantrell ladder, Huebner's life satisfaction scale, and then 10 domains of happiness, which they were able to put together with multifactorial analysis and work out that there were 10 domains of happiness that they were then using to give an overall index for happiness. But if you're not familiar with that one, I'll just go on a little bit more. That we ran the survey with primary school children in West Sussex, and we were able to put in those indexes with another measure of emotional resilience, looking at models of expressive suppression or of cognitive reappraisal. So are you an optimist or do you bury things deep inside? And we were able to use regression analysis to find that that was actually a driver of happiness. So if you had poor emotional regulation strategies, then you had lower happiness and life satisfaction scores, and other things were related to that, such as family structure, etc., or other strong drivers of happiness. I was just wondering if you knew anything further about work around emotional resilience and models of that that can lead towards happiness and well-being improvements that might help us in our local work. And then to Nancy, you mentioned at the end democracy and what democracy would look like if it was improving well-being, and I don't know if you've heard of work around participatory budgeting, which I think has been shown to, in some studies, there's not a huge bundle of them, but I don't know if you know anything more about that you might be able to share. Thank you.
No.
Is that the emotional regulation one?
Yeah, no, I know nothing about that. I mean, I know something about it. I don't know as much as people that are working in the area do. I know something about what work is being done with children to improve emotional resilience. I'm familiar with many of the academics that are working in that area. It's not my area of expertise, and I'm sure you, Rob, will know much more about that than I do.
And that's, I think, where when I listed the other measures that are being used, there's a whole load of psychological well-being ones where the criticism we get about the ONS for personal subjective well-being measures is that there's a whole larger psychological experience that we should be asking about and testing. I think one of the Scandinavian countries has like about 15 of these psychological well-being measures that are like vitality and joy and all these other things in there as well. So I think, and certainly if you're doing RCTs in different contexts, there are other measures that you would use that do that. Democracy, I said actually about how would you organise government. I've been having a discussion about how you would organise parliamentary accountability for outcomes, which is quite an interesting one. I think Scotland and Scottish Government are quite interesting in how they've organised their civil service around outcomes. Admittedly, not necessarily subjective well-being, actually. But you did ask about participatory budgeting. We've done a review of joint decision-making and well-being. No one has looked at participatory budgeting and the impact on well-being. That's because most of the research has been done around health. And so I think that particular link, I think there was a lot of research on democratic engagement processes and co-production and these types of things that really, 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 really needs to be synthesized. And it's the gap I would find it was the really strong gap I would find in our evidence research. I think there is research to be synthesized, but it doesn't have well-being impacts in terms of health or other well-being measures. It has other measures about how you do democratic accountability, democratic engagement measures as well. Two things I would say, though. One is that they are potentially incredibly expensive and don't reach many people. The ONS consultation, I think, reached 60,000 people in the UK, and that was massive for a consultation process. There are 60 million people. There are 14,000 policy officials. Most of them didn't even know it was happening. So you need to spend a lot of money to reach a lot of people. The other thing is it's very easy to do badly, and actually it was one of the few areas where we found negative consequences of well-being things. Mostly you find, oh yeah, it's good for well-being, great, music, singing, lovely, go do it. But joint decision-making was one of the ones we had a red flag about. You can have negative effects, and so I do think we need to think about it much more carefully. And I worry because when people take a public health approach to knife crime, for example, they go, oh, let's take a public health approach to knife crime, let's do participatory budgeting. And I don't think participatory budgeting is going to solve knife crime.
Question here.
Hello, I'm Dan Cook from the Higher Education Statistics Agency. We're just finishing up our first year of surveying, a census-level survey of all graduates 15 months out from finishing university. We've included the ONS4 in the survey, along with some other questions that we've devised ourselves. And we asked, it's a question about mode effects, really. So we'd already understood that we were likely to find happier graduates asking them those questions over the telephone than face-to-face. But with such a large population, we're obviously using an online method. I'm wondering if you know anything about what I can expect to find in the data when we start analysing it. Are people happier when they're asked online, or do we not know at all?
Chris, we asked online and we did both in the Olympics projects. Can you remember an effect?
I think there was slight mode effects. I wouldn't quite know right now in which direction they go. I think people on the phone, as you say, were happier, but there's obviously some sort of...
I guess if you're looking for differences, that's going to matter. That's going to matter less, right? Because you're going to have the absolute level is going to be affected by mode, but the relativities will be different. It's interesting to be doing that 15 months out from when they graduate to see what they're doing, because we know, as I talk about in Happy Ever After, the week that, again, correlational, randomised controlled trials, association between education and happiness is pretty weak. Don't do a PhD, anybody? That's you're probably more miserable to begin with. I think there's a huge selection effect, I reckon. That's probably causal in the opposite direction.
I've got time for one last question. Well, in that case, I would like... Oh, no. Okay. Dan, go for it. Oh, Paul.
Thank you. Sorry to grab the last question. Paul, and thanks for the name check, Paul Dolan. I'm now at Imperial College. I was reading a paper recently where one of the most cited papers is what can economists learn from happiness research? And it kind of gives the flavour, actually, that economists have rather kind of grabbed this topic over the last 20 years and are taking it forward. Now there's a whole range of measures. Actually, the person who wrote the article then went on to say, well, actually, social science has come together a bit. But given that this meeting is sponsored by the Social Research Association and the Royal Statistical Society, do you see that this is something that's working across social science, or is it still the domain of economists? Thank you.
It's a good question. Economists many of the economists that use well-being data came to it from labour economics, right? They found these data in the studies that they were looking at to look at labour market outcomes, and there's a life satisfaction question. It'd be interesting to see what happens with that, and they've kind of started exploring that. So a lot of what's been framed in economics has been around that kind of approach. I do think that economics as a discipline, you see it actually with the Nobel Prize most recently to Esther Duflo, is using randomised controlled trials much more. It's much more of a recognised methodology in economics, which is partly why I'm sort of saying we need to be getting these wellbeing measures in as a method of approach to looking at welfare appraisal, which I think will again change the nature and type of economics. I do think, psychologists have always been interested in measures of well-being. They're just not so good at being able to sell them to policymakers. Psychologists are not particularly good at doing that. They can do it for themselves, but they've often required economists as a way to kind of try to address some of the normative questions. Quantitative sociology, I think, using these measures. I do think there is a coalescence. I think that once you start with the ONS questions, I think one of the problems for me at the beginning was that there was a lack of clarity about what was going to happen with them once the data were being gathered. It's been very, very exciting to gather this data, but what are you going to do with it? But actually, those questions can then be asked once the data are gathered. You don't have to always have a question before you have the answer, in a sense. And I think that having those questions out there has kind of created, Nancy maybe can speak a bit more to this, but has created an interest. Again, like the labour economists, going back to the beginning, I found these data, these look interesting, what can I do with them? Even if we didn't know at the beginning how we were going to use those kinds of data. And I think that's bringing together different social scientists. I'm a inveterate optimist, according to Kahneman, so I'm optimistic about this. I'm optimistic about this in the sense of the measurement, gathering passive data potentially. And I'm optimistic about the different disciplines, in not just in social science, but I think he's saying with biological data and biometric data, to be able to bring these together in a way that answers substantively the question about whether people's lives are going better for them when we do stuff to them as parents, practitioners and policymakers.
Just last to say, the number of academic studies relating to well-being over the last 7 years has just absolutely ballooned. If you look at it's just massive, and I think it will continue. And they're all from loads of disciplines. Not all of the research councils, I think, fund some well-being research in some way.
And a big emphasis now on interdisciplinary working as well. So not only many different disciplines looking at this, but different disciplines working together. And I think on that note...
You should ask your question.
Yeah.
Go on, ask your question.
Is the what?
Ask your question, go on.
Ask the question you were going to ask.
Oh, okay. All right. We're late now, but still. Okay, so...
This has to be good, because this is the last question. Paul's was rubbish. Yours has to be really, good.
Lovely. I won't have a word against Paul. The trends. The temporal trends are very interesting. They have defied many expectations. One of the thing I wanted to ask was, well-being measures are underpinned by expectation. If we expect more, then we will judge in a different way to if we expect less. Is that a factor in the trends that we're seeing over time through a period of austerity?
So since 2016, well, austerity doesn't seem to have affected it as much as I would have expected. Since 2016, the progress has stalled. It's only being driven by England. Read into that what you will. If you look at the language used in popular culture now, we are the most pessimistic we've ever been. So maybe some expectations. Oh, it's not as bad as I expected. Employment has stayed very high, which is probably one of the reasons I like life satisfaction is it takes into account the economic things, like having a job, but it's less subtle on the other things that seem to matter as well. So I think employment, if that changes a lot, that will affect the data more than people expect.
So, a couple of things quickly. So, on the headline numbers, they're not particularly interesting. I mean, in a sense, GDP is not particularly interesting as a headline trend. You know, trend GDP 2% or whatever, trend well-being 2%. What's important is when you drill down into the numbers about who's doing well and who's doing badly before the aggregation. And so, you know, unemployment, if it goes from 5% to 10%, it can only have a 5% effect on the overall average, but it's having a 100% effect on those that are out of work. So that's why the disaggregation, I think, is significant. In relation to the expectations, again, it's part of what has drawn me to experiential measures. There's no perfect measure of anything. But there's for me, there's more of an absolute quantity in an emotion or in an experience than there is in an evaluation. And actually, you know, for most things, when people, and I'll finish on something that, you know, Kahneman drew our attention to many decades ago now, about focusing effects. You know, when we're all talking about how terrible things are, they're terrible. But actually, most of our lives are lived in and experienced, they're not terrible. You know, we're paying attention to the things that we're doing, some of which Nancy drew out in her slides, and for the most part, most of the time, you know, life is kind of going all right.
And a glass of wine is a very good thing, or juice, whatever is your preference. But I'd like to say an enormous thank you to you both, and to everyone for coming, and to the SRA and the RSX.